Welcome to hour number 2 of the Gary Sutton Show on a Tuesday morning here on News Radio 910 WSBA. I'm Gary Sutton, and, we look out there around the world right now. We see a lot more terrorist kinds of attacks going on. We look at Pakistan, for example, where they have been attacking over the past weekend at airports, and it's just not going away. And I remember not too long ago, we were talking about having terrorism on the run, having al-Qaeda on the run. We had killed Osama bin Laden. And yet terrorism seems to have metastasized into something else, where it's a multi-headed monster as opposed to one person sending out directions, if it ever was like that totally. But the fact that Osama bin Laden is dead and terrorism seems to be on the rise is certainly a difficult thing to deal with here in the country today and in the world in general. Peter Brookes is a national security, senior fellow for national security affairs at the Heritage Foundation, and we want to talk to him in just a moment. He wrote a great piece that was in the Boston Herald yesterday about this, and talking about the national conversation of late being riveted on terrorism, spurred on the controversy swirling around the Taliban prison swap. He said it's a good time to take stock of the state of Islamist militancy. And we're going to hopefully hook up here with Peter in just a moment. But he said the bottom line is this, that the threat is getting worse. And I guess that's one of the conversations that we're having today here in this country, the fact that we are getting worse in this whole situation, the fact that we can't really step away and say, well, for political purpose, we don't think it's worse. We can't do that. What is the reality of the moment? That's the big question. What is the reality of what is happening here today? I think that's what we've got to start to look at here. And unfortunately, I don't know that we're doing that. We're looking at things as we'd like them to be. We're looking at things through a political lens instead of looking at it through what is the realistic lens of what is going on in the country today. So the question is, are we taking this thing seriously? Are we taking it seriously? And we're with Peter Brookes right now, who's a senior fellow for national security affairs at the Heritage Foundation, and he joins us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Good morning, Peter. How are you?
Good morning.
Hey, Peter, I read your piece on Islamist threat on the rise, and it was really intriguing that you had in Boston Herald, so congratulations on that. But I know that you're watching these things all the time. One of the things that I worry about that your article kind of points to is the idea that we look at a world right now, sometimes politically, that we say this is the way we'd like it to be.
Yeah.
And yet we're not dealing with the realities of it at the moment.
Well, that's the whole idea of the column.
Yeah.
People are distracted. It's summertime. The whole Bo Bergdahl thing came up, kind of focus on the Taliban for a moment in Afghanistan. But I wanted people to know, some of the reading that I've been doing, there's some pretty alarming statistics out there. And, the president at one time had, characterized the Taliban as on the run and decimated. And my view is that, and I think it's the view of others, is that the situation is actually getting worse. And we shouldn't just believe that it's over there. It's someplace over there.
Right.
And it's not going to affect us here at all. Last year, I think a lot of people would be surprised that terrorist attacks worldwide, according to the U.S. State Department, were up 43%.
Wow.
And then another fellow who's a scholar at RAND, a government, not a government, but a private research organization which does a lot of government work, very well respected. This guy, Seth Jones, says that his accounting, and the numbers vary, of course, but his accounting is that there are about 100,000 jihadist fighters in the world. 100,000. That's a pretty good-sized army. Now, they're all not working together in the same place, but those sort of numbers kind of make your jaw hit the desk.
We were talking before you came on, Peter, about the idea that the president used to say, well, Osama bin Laden is dead, terrorism is on the run, al-Qaeda's on the run, and yet what we have now may be even more dangerous than when Osama bin Laden was in, because we have a multi-headed hydra now, it seems, in terrorism. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Osama bin Laden is dead, but al-Qaeda is alive. That's the fact. And unfortunately, I think the president has had a certain narrative since he came into office on foreign policy about, it was all about George Bush. All the problems we had in the world were about George Bush. They were George Bush's fault, and I'm going to fix it. And he hasn't. If you think domestic policy is a mess, take a look at our foreign policy. Now, I understand folks, regular folks, your listeners and others, they're concerned about the economy. Understand that.
Right.
Health care. putting food on the table, getting their kids educated. But the truth of the matter is that, we're still fighting a war in Afghanistan. There's still a lot of bad guys out there, and they have an intention of doing us harm. So the idea of another 9/11 is not inconceivable. I think we've made it much harder for them to do something like that, but there's, a lot of things going on in the world that, get in the little corner of the paper in a little, 100-word article that it doesn't make the headlines, that if you put them all together, and I tried to do this in this column, and I imagine it's still on bostonherald.com or at heritage.org, there's a lot of bad stuff going on. I mean, for instance, Gary, Syria. This has become, pre 9/11 Afghanistan.
Right.
There are foreign fighters. That doesn't include. I'm talking about foreign fighters. I'm not talking about Syrian types. There are 12,000 foreign fighters from 80 countries. Now, let me put that in context for you. In the world, there's probably the UN probably has 190 some countries as members. So you're talking about half of the countries in the world have not provided, but people have come from half the countries in the world to Syria to fight the government there. The government's not a bunch of choir boys. They're not a bunch of good actors either, but there's at least 12,000 foreign fighters that have gone there. It's become a magnet. In fact, there are more Al-Qaeda types and other militant extremists in Syria than at any place at any time that anybody has ever thought of. There wasn't even that many in Afghanistan before 9/11. And the problem is that not only are they fighting the government there, Al-Qaeda's got a hold on things, and there's a tremendous bloodshed, 150 to 60,000 people killed on both sides, millions of refugees. But the director of national intelligence has said this publicly. They are developing training camps, not only for fighting the Bashar Assad regime in Damascus, but for sending these people that have gone to Syria back home to undertake acts of terror there at some point. And in recent weeks, we've seen some folks along these lines. The Brits have arrested people going to Syria. The first American, and then experts aren't sure about this, but a week or so ago, a young American participated in a truck bombing in Syria, a suicide attack. And this may be the first suicide attack by an American in that conflict. It seems experts are unclear about that. But there are Americans. They say that there are 70 Americans who have gone, at least 70 Americans who have gone to Syria to fight, and there's 3,000 Europeans who have gone there to fight. So this is a huge problem, and I'm just talking about Syria.
They talk about too that they built up in Syria camps that are training these recruits right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the problem. They're not only training them for fighting. They're not only training them for fighting in Syria. They're training them to come back to the United States and other places, Europe, to undertake acts of terror. In fact, there was an attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels. About 3 people were killed by a Frenchman, and he was a jihadist who had been trained in Syria. The Spanish have arrested people that were recruiting for the war in Syria and Spain. This is a very, very big problem that it's not just something that's over there. In this globalized world we live in. And think about it, Gary. If you had people, you remember, to come to the United States, we travel overseas. Like we want to go to Canada. We take our passport. We need a passport now to go to Canada, but we don't need a visa, right? We don't have to go to the consulate. We don't have to go to the embassy and get somebody to interview us to see if we're involved in anything untoward, trying to immigrate and stay there, overextend our time. Most countries that we're friendly with, we can travel to for usually 60, 90 days without having a visa. People say, people go on tourism. They're going to visit friends and whatever, and then they're going to come back home. But for a lot of countries, we require a visa. But many of the countries in Europe, we don't require visas. So somebody with a European passport, if they would go to Syria to learn the terrorist dark arts, come back to Europe, they potentially could buy an airplane ticket with their passport and travel to the United States. Hopefully, law enforcement and people, I've heard that this is the biggest concern of the FBI today, people who may be traveling to Syria. The other thing is, I don't think right now with the borders the way they are in Syria, there's any passport control. You'd never be able to look at somebody's passport and say they've been to Syria. So people are going to Turkey. People are going to Jordan. In fact, this young man who was involved in the suicide attack, the newspapers report that he was telling his parents he was in Jordan. which is a bordering state to Syria, but he actually was in Syria.
So again, we have fertile ground here, much like Afghanistan was before 9/11, where you can, learn the dark arts, as you mentioned a moment ago, for terrorism, and then export that out as need be to other countries. Maybe not in attacks as big as the World Trade Center, although I don't know, but attacks nevertheless.
Absolutely. I mean, this is obviously the concern that these individuals will be able to travel to the United States. They might be able to slip across our borders, seemingly legally, because they will have a passport. They will have the documentation to travel to the United States. They will have an airline ticket, and then once they get here, they might decide to build a bomb in their kitchen and undertake an attack. So the FBI has to make sure that they're working closely with the Europeans. Well, of course, we're talking about 80 countries, right? I mean, they're not all focusing on the United States. I expect there might be attacks in Europe as well. They feel very threatened. The Brits and others feel very threatened by this, and we've seen some things, this attack in Brussels. I mean, they might be smaller things, but you never know what they're thinking about. And the idea is the important takeaway is they still have us in their crosshairs. A lot of people want to say, it's over there. It's about Syria. It's about Afghanistan. They really don't want to do us any harm. We're finding out that that's not necessarily true. And if they have a place to plan, train, and operate without anybody interfering with them, we could easily come into their crosshairs if we're not currently. So we just can't forget about it. We can't become complacent about our security. That's the real issue here. I'm not trying to be an alarmist.
Right.
I think there's enough evidence out there to say, yeah, we should be concerned about this. And we certainly don't want to see, terrorism come to our shores again. But, over the last 10 years, we've had 60 attempted attacks here in the United States. Some of them have been successful. Fort Hood, for instance, right? The Boston was just a year or so ago, right? So the Boston Marathon bombing. So, it may not be in the scale of 9/11, but still, you don't want that sort of violence, taking place in your country.
We're talking with Peter Brookes, Senior Fellow for National Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. You make a point of saying in your article here that don't just look at Syria right now, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and you look at Pakistan, the attacks over the weekend by the Taliban. You look at Iraq right now, where they're having elections, and they're having all kinds of attacks there. So it's become the way of doing things there, right?
Yeah. Well, Iraq is a huge problem. Actually the groups, the Al Qaeda groups that are operating in Iraq in Syria are also operating across the border in Iraq. Al Qaeda is holding cities in Iraq today. And this is kind of a lesson for us, in my view, of what could happen in Afghanistan when we leave. I mean, we left no troops in Iraq to help in terms of, it doesn't have to be combat operations, but intelligence or logistics or mobility or training. We just pulled out. The Obama administration pulled out, and the country is really in turmoil. And the same thing could happen with Afghanistan. But Pakistan had these attacks. They attacked a major airport in a major city in Pakistan this weekend. Libya is a mess. The militias and the terrorists are running amok. Yemen is probably the one that threatens us the most. If you're looking at an organized Al-Qaeda group, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they have Al-Qaeda's best bomb maker. Nigeria, we saw Boko Haram take all those poor schoolgirls who, to my knowledge, have not been released yet.
Right.
Somalia has Al-Shabaab, and there are Americans who have gone to Somalia, Somali Americans that have gone to Somalia to fight there. So there's a concern about them coming back. And, of course, the neighbors are also affected. So it's a pretty serious problem. I don't want to just keep beating. I'm not beating the drum, I don't believe, unnecessarily. I think there's plenty of evidence out there, and if people want to look at the news, just do a Google search. I think they'll be kind of surprised at how many incidents there are around the world.
As you mentioned about Syria, what began as the Arab Spring has now morphed maybe in the Islamist Spring, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we thought this, when the Arab Spring came about 3 years ago, I mean, there were peaceful protests in Syria.
Right.
I mean, Syria, the government of Syria is not a bunch of, nice guys. I mean, it's a brutal dictatorship, and they wanted change. And what happened is it developed into a civil war. So when everybody thought the Islamist Spring, the Arab Spring was going to be the release of these democratic forces, liberalism, the idea of openness, transparency, it hasn't developed that way. way. It's really become the Islamist Springs. The forces that were released were the Islamist forces. I mean, look at even Syria. Look at Egypt today. It's not run by the Islamists, but it's also not very free either. So this is unfortunately it's the violence. The peaceful Arab Spring movement has really turned into a violent Islamist Spring campaign.
Peter, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Me.
Appreciate it. Take care. Peter Brookes, the National Security Affairs Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, with us here this morning on the Gary Sutton Show. When we come back, Richard Himmelfarb, the Director of Political Science at Hofstra University, will check in with us on President Obama prepares to take the executive action, which he did yesterday, expanding student loan program. What's that all about? We'll find out when we return here on the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA.